Howdy viewers, my name is Henry, and this is Wild West Film School. In today's episode, we're covering The Searchers, and it's not lost on me how daunting a task that is. The Searchers is monumental in film history and widely regarded as not just one of the greatest westerns ever made, but one of the greatest films of all time. Released in 1956, The Searchers was directed by John Ford, arguably the most important filmmaker to ever live. He's your favorite filmmaker's favorite filmmaker, so to speak. Everyone from Kurosawa to Bergman to Scorsese credit Ford's direction as a profound influence on their work and to the cinematic art form as a whole. On top of that, you've got John Wayne starring in what may be his best performance. The Searchers is often hailed as both Wayne and Ford's magnum opus, along with being revered as the definitive classical western of old Hollywood. And while the film does have all the elements of an escapist western adventure, it's more than just a spectacle. The Searchers is quite reflective and critical of its characters, their actions, and of Ford's previous portrayals of the West. With that being said, the film isn't without its dated and problematic elements. But we shouldn't disregard art that's a product of its time. If anything, that's more of a reason to appreciate and gain insight from The Searchers as a piece of film history. And there is a lot to learn from this film. Our protagonist is Ethan Edwards, a battle-hardened Civil War veteran who, upon the return to his brother's remote Texas homestead, faces tragedy when a ruthless band of Comanche raiders massacres Ethan's family and abducts his 9-year-old niece, Deborah. Fueled by hatred and a thirst for vengeance, Ethan embarks on a 5-year odyssey to rescue the girl. But as the years go by and the searchers track down their lost Debbie, will the girl they find be the same person Ethan once knew? While all the characters and events in the film are a work of fiction, The Searchers is actually inspired by the true story of Cynthia Ann Parker, who was abducted in a Comanche raid when she was 9 years old. Parker assimilated into the Comanche lifestyle, taking the Comanche name Narua and even marrying the chief and bearing his children. She was then unwillingly taken by Texas Rangers 24 years later, who separated her from her 3 sons and forced Parker to conform back to Anglo-American society. I'm well aware that with the plot synopsis I provided, modern audiences might be hesitant to embrace a film which, on the surface, seems like nothing more than your standard racist cowboys and Indians tale, and a particularly egregious case at that, with the savage Indians massacring an innocent white family who are then avenged by our heroic white cowboys. But this is where The Searchers gets interesting. While I'd hesitate to call the film progressive, or let alone a fair depiction of Native Americans, The Searchers isn't just a racist movie, it's a movie about racism, and the toll that prejudice and hate have on a person. I think way too many people misinterpret this film as an endorsement of Ethan's behavior simply because it's a western from the 50s, and we're supposed to disregard these kinds of films as nothing more than outdated white male fantasies. But as I established in my analysis of High Noon, the westerns of this era are just as capable of profound social commentary. Ford takes John Wayne's classic alpha male persona and portrays the far darker reality of these kinds of individuals. Ethan Edwards is a self-righteous asshole who, apart from children, treats everyone around him with contempt and indifference. Ethan's a bully, he makes people uncomfortable, he only ever laughs when it's at someone else's expense, and he lashes out when people disagree with him. On top of that, he's a racist, and not in the casual racism that any white settler would have had on the frontier. I mean, this guy hates the Comanche so much that he'll shoot the eyes out of a corpse he finds so its spirit can't go to the afterlife. Or he'll massacre buffalo just so Comanche will starve, men, women, and children. As the search progresses, we come to realize that Ethan's obsession with finding Debbie isn't as noble or heroic as it seems. If anything, he's more interested in hunting Comanche, and saving a little girl is the justification to act upon his racial hatred. In fact, when Ethan finally does find Debbie, he decides it'd be better to murder her, because there's no point in saving her if she's been tainted by the Comanche lifestyle. Ethan is a crazy person, and half the interactions he has in this film are just people telling him to chill the fuck out. It's clear that Ethan's time in the war has left him a broken man, spiteful, emotionally volatile, and afraid to show any kind of vulnerability. In this film, that old-school, stoic masculinity isn't cool or admirable. Ethan pushes away anyone who cares about him and damns himself to an eternally lonely existence because of it. He's a fascinating character and precursor to the anti-hero archetype that dominates the Western genre today. Accompanying Ethan during the search is his adopted nephew Martin Pauly, whom Ethan resents because he's not related by blood, and especially because Martin is part Cherokee. Martin functions as the film's moral compass, a younger, more open-minded voice that challenges Ethan's hate and cynicism. Throughout the film, Martin calls out Ethan's behavior, and the pair's clashing ideologies come to a head after they discover that Debbie has been indoctrinated by the Comanche. Ethan believes that she is too far gone, and they should just massacre the entire tribe, Debbie included. But Martin still has hope that she can be saved. In an effort to convince Martin of what needs to be done, Ethan reveals it was this very band of Comanche that killed Martin's parents. This is the part where you'd expect the film to have Martin learn his lesson. The world is cruel, natives are murderous savages, and big macho tough guy John Wayne was right the whole time. Especially because Martin hasn't been portrayed as particularly bright. He's a bit of a himbo and totally naive. But The Searchers subverts this. Martin sticks to his principles, and it's Ethan who comes around in the end.
You remember that scalp strung on Scar's lance? It was your mother's.
That don't change it. That don't change nothing.
While I'll always give The Searchers credit for its protagonist and themes being directly critical of racism, what about the actual representation of the Comanche themselves? Well...
Why are you white?
Yeah, so the Comanche chief, our main antagonist, is a German-American actor in Redface, with the laughably evil name Scar. Apart from cringing at this overt racism, I simply can't take Scar seriously as a villain. Perhaps to a 1956 audience, this guy was intimidating, but today it looks and sounds like a white guy playing dress-up, and anytime he's on screen, I'm taken out of the movie. And let me clarify, I have no issue with the Comanche being the antagonists of a Western narrative. These were brutal raiders and vicious warriors, still multifaceted human beings, but absolutely capable of monstrous acts of violence. But here we have this goofy-looking white guy with the silly name and dumb voice that kills any investment I have in the stakes of the narrative. It's a damn shame and completely unnecessary casting choice. Eli Wallach as Tuco in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is an example of brownface, but I wouldn't be surprised if you never noticed because he completely sells the role. That is not the case here. The one actually indigenous actor with a speaking role is Buela Archuleta, who plays Wild Goose Flying in the Night Sky, or Look, as she's called after a miscommunication with Martin. While trading goods with some natives, Martin accidentally purchases Look as his wife. She tags along for a bit, but Martin wants nothing to do with her, and Ethan just finds the whole thing funny.
You didn't buy any blanket. You bought her. You got yourself a wife, Sonny.
I'll admit the situation is pretty funny, until Martin drop-kicks her down a fucking hill. Jesus. Naturally, Look gets the fuck away from these two, only for them to later find her murdered by soldiers hunting Comanche. And I quite appreciate this little moment. Nowadays, most of us would immediately cringe at Ethan and Martin's treatment of this poor native woman, but I'm sure back in the 50s, audiences were laughing their asses off at Look's expense. But now she's dead. The characters, and by extension the audience, are forced to reflect on their behavior. We get so swept up in the abuse when it's framed as slapstick comedy that we lose sight of what we're actually laughing at: violent dehumanization. This is the kind of stuff that makes John Ford such a master of his craft. He's an expert storyteller who effortlessly engages, and in this case implicates, viewers into his narratives. But for some reason today, audiences and even younger cinephiles have collectively refused to engage with his films in good faith. Perhaps it's because they're old, or more likely because of the racism, but I think it's because with the spaghetti and revisionist westerns of the 60s and 70s up to the neo-westerns of today, Ford's classical westerns seem like an antiquated relic of a bygone and, for all intents and purposes, worse era. Less thematically rich, less technically impressive, and jam-packed with dated tropes and cliches that were just too good for now. But when watching his films, you'll come to realize that that's just not the case. Ford does love cliché, but he uses cliché as a tool, not a crutch, employing established archetypes and story beats to reel the audience in, only to subvert these conventions in a way that's all the more effective because when you're dealing with clichés, subversions are no longer just a twist within the story, but a twist of how we expect these stories to go. Ford's narratives keep you on your toes because of this. Ethan Edwards enters the film appearing as our wise and heroic cowboy, but he's revealed to be a violent, unstable dickhead. Martin at first seems like the naive youth who's too soft for his own good, but his compassion is proven right in the end. Look first appears as our token minority comic relief to be mocked and belittled, but we're then told no. Doing so is wrong and you should feel bad about it. Chief Scar is initially presented as a one-dimensional villain who attacked Ethan's innocent family for no reason, but it's revealed that his own family was killed by white settlers. Even the film's closing shot takes the familiar imagery of a lone figure triumphantly riding off into the sunset and presents it as a melancholy retreat into existential loneliness. Ford's innovation as a filmmaker and storyteller extend beyond the thematic and into the technical. While never a particularly flashy filmmaker, Ford's direction was always incredibly intentional and efficient. Not to say that his films aren't beautiful. From the opening frame, The Searchers establishes itself as an awe-inspiring spectacle, but what makes Ford's visuals so amazing isn't just the beautiful locations, but his composition of said locations and placement of actors within the frame.
I'm very sensitive to the way he uses his camera to paint his pictures and the way he frames things and the way he stages and blocks his people, often keeping the camera static while the people give you the illusion there's a lot more kinetic movement occurring when there's not. So, you know, in that sense, he's like a classic painter, you know, and he celebrates the frame, not just, you know, what happens inside of it. And so I have to look at The Searchers. Have to.
Through his precise blocking, Ford conveys power, isolation, longing, characters' connection, or lack thereof. A seemingly mundane dialogue sequence is just as dynamic as an action set piece. A vast landscape is just as striking as an intimate close-up. Flashy camera moves are used sparingly but effectively to heighten the momentum of action or the weight of emotion. Interestingly enough, Ford never thought of film as an art, but as a job, stating, "It's no use talking to me about art. I make pictures to pay the rent. There are some great artists in the business, I am not one of them." To Ford, filmmaking was a trade, and his job was to engage and entertain. It was never about personal expression, but pleasing an audience. If you please the audience, you please the studio, which pays the bills. So the last thing you want is to bore an audience.
Now remember this. When the horizon's at the bottom, it's interesting. When the horizon's at the top, it's interesting. When the horizon's in the middle, it's boring as shit.
One of the Searchers' standout scenes is the Comanche raid at the Edwards Ranch. From the get-go, the atmosphere is so unnerving. The imagery of a remote homestead isolated in a barren landscape, engulfed in the surreal orange hues of the desert sunset, is almost dreamlike, a beautiful nightmare. Could you imagine the sheer terror of this situation? What are you supposed to do? Today, media has conditioned us to fear masked boogeymen breaking into our homes in what? The suburbs? Now imagine life on the frontier. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, no one to save you from a slow, agonizing death at the hands of a people you can't begin to understand. Ethan's brother and sister-in-law try and keep their cool as to not frighten the children, and we stew in this haunting atmosphere until the eldest daughter, Lucy, breaks the silence, letting out a blood-curdling scream. And after all this buildup, we don't see a single act of violence, only the aftermath when Ethan returns the next morning. I think this was a great decision. It mystifies the Comanche as an almost supernatural force of nature and personification of the unforgiving frontier. This aura does get diminished a bit as we see more and more of the Comanche in broad daylight, but it's still a great introduction to our antagonistic force. Another part of The Searchers I adore is the chunk of the film where Martin's love interest, Lori, reads a letter chronicling his journey so far. It seamlessly blends her reading the letter to Martin's voiceover narration to no narration at all throughout an extended 15-minute sequence. This presentation is great at making us feel the passage of time and the scale of the journey. Also, this is just a narrative structure I personally enjoy. It reminded me of Amadeus or The Irishman, where the narration isn't some sort of omniscient thing, but an actual character at some point in the story recounting events. I think that's neat. And we have to talk about the film's famous climactic battle, where a combination of cowboys, Texas Rangers, and U.S. cavalry storm a Comanche village. This is classic Western imagery in its purest form, the kind of stuff you conjure in your head when imagining the Wild West. This could very well be the definitive Western set piece in film history, challenged only by the climactic Mexican standoff in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But then again, that sequence is so idiosyncratically distinct to spaghetti westerns, I don't think you can compare it. The tracking shot following the racing gunmen on horseback is exhilarating, and the uncertainty of whether Ethan will kill or save Debbie is gripping. But of course, Ethan comes around with this iconic line.
Let's go home, Debbie.
This is the kind of classic old Hollywood sincerity that I feel we've lost in this snarky and self-aware postmodern era of film. If this movie had come out today, Ethan grandly sweeping Debbie into the air as the music swells would jump cut to some stupid gag to undercut the beauty of the moment. Oh, wait. Maybe film isn't so different nowadays. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not huge on the comedy in this film. Not that I don't like comedy in my westerns, or even the wacky theatricality of old Hollywood humor, I just think it messes with this film's structure and it's always kind of jarring. Humor is a natural part of life, and it's not impossible to appropriately incorporate that into the story, but The Searchers has a very, this is a dark scene, this is a comedic scene, structure that feels kind of phony. I think of the Coen brothers and how naturally their humor flows throughout the narrative, especially in their westerns, which can get very dark, but it always feels grounded in the reality of the story. There is one character I do think is really funny, though. Ken Curtis excels as the country simpleton Charlie McCory.
So he married a Comanche squaw. Ha ha ha.
I'd hardly know you.
Yes, I can't hardly recognize the face.
Anyways, Debbie has been liberated from the Comanche, and our film comes to a close with the Searchers returning Debbie, not to her family, because, you know, but the neighboring Jurgensen family. Martin reunites with his love, Lori, and everyone's happy and together again, except for Ethan, who solemnly gazes into the doorway at the warmth and happiness before him, only to turn and wander back into the wild, with the doorway acting as a frame within the frame representing Ethan's eternal isolation and inability to live a normal life. He's simply too broken. The search for Debbie gave his life some semblance of purpose, but now that that's been fulfilled, Ethan returns to the aimless waste from which he came and where he's destined to forever remain. God damn, what an ending. This shot is rightfully iconic. It's so simple, but so meaningful and so effective. As I said, John Ford knows how to evoke emotion from the frame. With that, we have The Searchers. Needless to say, this film is a masterpiece. Some of the cultural and technical differences from today's filmmaking might make The Searchers hard to resonate with for modern audiences, but if you can take the film for what it is, you will not regret the experience. An absolute must-watch for any Western fan, and especially for any student of film. Okay, you know what time it is. Let's close this review off with some fun facts I came across in my research for this video. Natalie Wood, who played Debbie as a teenager, was still in high school when the film was being made, so on several occasions, John Wayne and Jeffrey Hunter had to pick her up from school. Naturally, this caused a good deal of excitement from Wood's female classmates. The eccentric, Comanche-raised character of Mose Harper, played by Hank Worden, is loosely based on an actual historical folk character called Mad Mose, a legendary half-crazy Indian fighter of the American Southwest with a fondness for rocking chairs. A significant insight to Ethan Edwards' glaring hatred of the Comanche is actually revealed in a throwaway prop. Just before the raid at the Edwards homestead, Debbie hides by the tombstone of Ethan's mother, where it states that she was killed by Comanches. Western star and Ford collaborator Harry Carey died in 1947. John Ford cast Carey's wife and son in The Searchers as a tribute to Carey. In the closing shot of Wayne framed in the doorway, he holds his right elbow with his left hand in a pose that Carey fans would recognize as one that he often used. Wayne stated he did it as a tribute to Carey, while off camera, his wife Olive watched. After shooting, actor Ward Bond would walk around his motel room naked with the curtains open in the hopes of attracting co-actress Vera Miles. As you can imagine, this did not have the intended results. The local Navajo of the shooting location, Monument Valley, were hired as Comanche extras for the film. During filming, a Navajo child became seriously ill with pneumonia and needed urgent medical attention. John Wayne had his own airplane and had his pilot take the little girl to a hospital. For his deed, the Navajos named him the Man with the Big Eagle. Finally, considering the part of Ethan Edwards to be the best character that he ever played, John Wayne named his youngest son Ethan in homage to his favorite role. Alright everyone, that's it for this review. I hope you enjoyed the video and let me know what Western I should cover next. Until next time, thanks for watching.